but I think we will get started. So welcome to the latest in the Food Equity Seminar series of the Food Equity Centre. So the Food Equity Centre is made up of leading actors in food security and social justice. And the seminar series engages with scholarly debates and policy and practice on equity across the food system. So I will post the link in the chat later for anyone who wants to see previous seminars in the series. And as with previous seminars, we'll hear a 30 to 40 minute seminar, and then after that there'll be time for questions and discussion. So you can either post in the chat box, or you can raise your hand after the seminar to speak in person. And then at other times, of course, I request that you keep your mic muted to avoid interference. And you probably just heard this meeting will be recorded. So we are very happy to have Professor Peter Rossett here with us today. Hi, Peter. So I first met Peter here in Thailand, where he's a visiting professor at the Social Research Institute of Chulalongkorn University here in Bangkok. But his major academic position is with Ecosur in Mexico, where he's speaking from today. And he also holds professorial appointments with universities in Brazil. He's a busy man. And then alongside his academic positions, Peter is deeply involved in the global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, and he recently retired from 15 years in the Secretariat. And it's that combination of academia and activism that makes Peter very well placed for the topic of today's seminar, which is agroecology as a science and a movement. And in fact, he wrote the book on it, and the link is in the bio for this talk. So we're very happy to have you, Peter, and please, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Jody. I look forward to seeing you soon in Thailand, and I'm happy to be connected with everybody else. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. So I'm going to talk about agroecology in terms of movement aspects, with particular emphasis on how small farmer peasant agroecology can be brought to a larger scale, to a more important scale. Now, agroecology itself is the scientific side of agroecology. It is the basis for sustainable agriculture. It's an inter and transdisciplinary science of how agricultural systems work, also how to design them. And it also refers to practices, farming practices that are more sustainable. And it's also a social movement in and of itself. And it's important to understand the political reality in which agroecology is an issue, in which peasant movements and indigenous peoples movements are in the process of constructing processes to help their membership transform their production to more agroecological production. But they're doing so in a countryside. It doesn't matter really what country of the world we're talking about, a countryside where territories are being disputed between serving the interests of global markets versus the interests of local people and local needs and the local environment. Summarized in the image below from Paraguay, where soybean plantations are in areas where peasants have been displaced by land grabbing, and where riot police are necessary to protect the pesticide fumigation from the peasants who are expelled from that land. So when we talk about different kinds of food systems, we really have a global confrontation between the industrial food chain and the peasant food web. That has a lot of implications at a landscape scale, has implications for biodiversity at a landscape scale. And it's important to explode the myth that the industrial food system, the corporate industrial food system, is really the system that's feeding us. In fact, today, the small scale food producers, including peasants, indigenous people, nomadic pastoralists, fisher folk, etc., are producing about 70% of the food consumed by humanity, despite the fact that they only have access to 25% of the land. And so that's a very important thing to note, because a lot of people question whether peasant agriculture in general or peasant agroecology specifically could feed the world. The answer is that it's currently feeding the world. And if we need to produce more food, we have to get rid of that extremely inefficient industrial food system, which uses a huge amount of land to produce very little food. An example of this is from the agricultural census in Brazil, which shows that peasants and family farmers get 14% of credit. They have 25% of land, but they have 40% of total agricultural production. When we talk about food, that's 70% and 74% of employment. Whereas agribusiness has 76% of the land, almost all of the credit, and only produces 30% of the food. And this is what we see in many countries in the world. Some of my previous research has shown that small farms in general produce far more per hectare than large farms, that high input industrial agriculture like the Green Revolution boosts productivity in the first couple of decades of wherever it's implemented, but then causes an erosion of the productive capacity of resources like soil. And so productivity begins to level off and then decline. And also my research has shown that the more agroecological and integrated or diverse a farm is, the greater the total production, both per hectare and also per unit of labor. Now, as Jody said, I have accompanied the global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, peasant small farmer movement. I'm still with Via Campesina Mexico and also supporting Via Campesina Thailand currently. Via Campesina is the largest human movement in the world after large religions like Islam and Christianity, probably speaks for some 200 million rural families in all continents, 80 countries. And what I want to show in this set of images is that it's engaged in both the political struggle as well as appropriating and transforming production systems in an agroecological way. It's a global movement, just a few images to show how global it is. And of course, Via Campesina is known for having put forth the idea of food sovereignty instead of the dominant paradigm of food security. The reason being is that food security doesn't say anything about how food is produced, where it's produced, or by whom it's produced, whereas Via Campesina and many social movements believe that's very important. It's not the same if food is produced agroecologically as if it's produced with poisons and GMOs. It's not the same if it's produced in the same country or halfway around the world. And it's not the same if it's produced by small farmers as if it's produced by giant corporations. So agroecology is seen by social movements, peasant social movements, as a key pillar in the construction of food sovereignty. If people have questions as to what food sovereignty is, we can address that in the discussion. But there are a lot of advantages to peasant and family farm-based agroecology compared to industrial agriculture, which range from healthy food for local people, conserving rural livelihoods and cultures, more resilient to climate and other shocks, lower greenhouse gas emissions, lower probability of emergent diseases. This is something I won't go into now, but we could come back to in the discussion if people are interested. The industrial food system is implicated in the causes of COVID, and in the comorbidity of COVID, and in the ability to feed people during lockdowns. This is something that we would address with a food sovereignty agroecological system. Agroecology is lower production costs, leading to less indebtedness, better way to have good stewardship of productive resources and biodiversity, and provides greater autonomy and less external dependence for farm families. Now, we've talked about agroecology as a science. Principally, what it's about is knowledge, and the knowledge of agroecological farming practices and also the input into the science of agroecology really comes from the knowledge and practices of smallholder farmers accumulated over thousands of years. When we talk about the Western science of agroecology, it's really a dialogue amongst different kinds of knowledge between this accumulated peasant knowledge and Western sciences like ecology, agronomy, anthropology, rural sociology, agricultural economics, etc. But in terms of farming, nature is the model for agroecology. So agroecologists, whether we're scientists or farmers, try to learn from, emulate, and coexist with natural ecosystem processes. Now, when I say agroecology is about knowledge, when urban people around the world see an image like this, they have all kinds of prejudices. They think maybe this is an ignorant, uneducated person. But in fact, agroecological scientists have analyzed the peasant knowledge that goes into peasant agriculture. And it turns out that peasant farmers are continually integrating complex forms of knowledge and information, whether we're talking about climatic phenomena and ecological interactions, market conditions, soil conditions, technologies, how all of these things that are evolving over time. And so, in fact, probably urban people wouldn't have any even close to that ability to, in real time, integrate very complex kinds of knowledge. So we need to remember peasant agriculture in general is about knowledge, and peasant agroecology as much or more so. Principal characteristic of agroecology is that it's applying ecological principles and social principles, not in a recipe fashion. Rather, different principles are materialized in different ways in accordance with each unique local reality, which means activating farmer knowledge and creativity. We have a problem, however, if we want to implement processes of agroecological transformation, is that the Green Revolution, which was imposed from externally onto peasant and small farmer communities, caused the loss of a lot of farmer knowledge, made farmers lose creativity, come to depend on outside knowledge. And so that's a problem that has to be overcome. Now, the principles of agroecology in black, we have some of the technical and principles. Blue is ecological, and red social principles, that agroecology really depends on social organization and process in order to be scaled up and multiplied. Otherwise, it can just be one farm family that's agroecological and nobody else learns from them or does anything on the basis of their experience. And I'll go into that a little bit more. So a major challenge remains. We can accept that agroecological farming would be better if everybody in the world did it. But in many cases, due to the political reality that I showed in the first slides, that peasant agriculture, peasant agroecology is under threat. It's difficult to develop processes because there's so many things in the corporate dominated policy system that work against it. So we have the challenge of how do we bring peasant and family farm agroecology to scale such that it's practiced by ever more families over ever larger territories. And my research has focused on that, as well as my work within the global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, where for 15 years I was part of the technical support team accompanying processes of peasant organizations around the world to multiply peasant agroecology. Here at Ecosur in Mexico, we have the research group on the massification or scaling up of agroecology. This was our emblematic paper that came out a couple of years ago that summarizes our analysis of emblematic cases around the world where peasant agroecology was successfully brought to a much larger scale in terms of identifying the key drivers or lessons from those cases. Some of the things we identified that are factors in achieving scale are social organization, social movements, and their ability to mobilize, to create social organization and mobilize it, using horizontal social process methodology and horizontal pedagogies are key. Peasant protagonism, in the sense that most of the success stories were led by the peasants' own organizations and not by external actors like NGOs or government officials or academics or others. They depend on agroecological farming practices that actually work. You can't multiply something that doesn't work. You have to have a motivating discourse and framing within the peasant organization, in the sense that people have to be motivated to take the plunge into changing what they're doing. Often certain political opportunities were very important. External allies are important as long as they don't have the lead in the process. When they're supportive is when we get the big success. Many times charismatic local leaders were important. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes favorable markets, like a better price for ecological produce, as well as favorable public policies. We put the favorable public policies last because they're so rare. In 90% or 99% of all countries in the world, almost every public policy is unfavorable to peasant agriculture and unfavorable to agroecology. So the success stories have more often been despite public policies as a result, instead of being because of public policies. So, as I said, we're trying to ask who scales up agroecology, how and why. We've seen important test cases. We've also seen that agroecology itself is a territory in dispute because we're now facing the corporate co-optation, greenwashing of agribusiness with commercial organics and that kind of thing confusing the issue. But finally, one of the key conclusions is that social organization is the culture medium in which agroecology grows and spreads at a territorial level. The horizontal social process methodologies are key, and the global agroecology process in La Via Campesina is based on horizontal exchanges and on peasant and farmer agroecology schools. Now, I'll show you a couple of these emblematic cases that we've analyzed and that are also either within or both within and beyond Via Campesina organizations. The most successful case in the world right now of massive upscaling and multiplication, massification of peasant agroecology is in India. The most successful case in terms of the absolute number of farmers, because we're talking about more than 10 million families over the last, say, 20 years who, through this grassroots movement, have changed their farming practices and broken with the Green Revolution monoculture model. In India, it's called zero budget natural farming. The name itself is illustrative because natural farming is inspired by the Japanese agroecologist Fukuoka, and it means farming with nature instead of farming against nature. As I said before, that nature is the model for agroecology. Zero budget is refers to the enormous agrarian and crisis and epidemic of farmer suicides in India due to the high production costs of the monoculture model and how that has led to indebtedness and finally land loss by Indian peasants. So this is something that we've analyzed a lot, this zero budget movement. It's based on typical agroecological processes like making bio preparations, bocaccis, highly diverse farming systems, agroforestry systems, huge farmer knowledge exchanges. And this is an example of how the international process in La Via Campesina as a global social movement works. This was when we did an exchange with of representatives from peasant organizations from many other parts of Asia who came and spent 2 weeks in Karnataka, India, and visited dozens and dozens of natural farming farms, exchanged with the farmers and learned from their experiences. And this has led to new processes of zero budget natural farming in various other countries, ranging from Sri Lanka to Nepal, to Philippines, to Indonesia. Remembering that in none of these cases are they making an exact copy, because agroecology, as I said, is principles. It's not recipe basis copying, but a lot of inspiration and new ideas for designing their agroecology processes within the farmer organizations in these other countries. Now let's come back to this knowledge issue. As I said before, the Green Revolution was based on knowledge from outside peasant and farmer communities. It was about the imposition, the epistemic colonization, and this took place through the know-it-all university-trained agronomist who came with all prepared in agronomy faculties around the world for commercial monoculture agriculture. Basically, the message transmitted to peasants by extension agents and agronomists was that your knowledge is antiquated, no longer useful. You need to change what you're doing. You need to change what you think. You should get rid of these complex, diverse polyculture, intercropping, agroforestry traditional systems. You should do a monoculture. You should buy commercial seeds. You should buy chemical fertilizer. You should buy herbicide, buy fungicide, buy insecticide, buy machinery, buy irrigation equipment. And you notice a pattern. Everything that they told people to do involved buying something, which involved getting credit, which involved getting into debt, which involved losing the land, and involved farmer suicides like in India. And this imposition of knowledge led to the crushing of farmer initiative, protagonism, knowledge, practices, and the typical diverse peasant landscape end up turning into green desert monocultures. So when this happened, farmer knowledge of how to produce for thousands of years before in each local biome, territory, ecosystem luckily wasn't completely lost, but it was fragmented, atomized, broke up into little pieces, and maybe one family still has some traditional seeds of one crop variety. Another family may still have a local livestock breed. Another family may still have some locally adapted fruit tree species. But in terms of collective knowledge, none of all of that knowledge is held in the hands or the heads of any one family. It's fragmented, atomized, dispersed, and semi, but not completely lost within most communities around the world. So I've mentioned social process methodology, and I'm going to take our second emblematic case, which is Cuba, to show how a social process methodology can discover that kind of knowledge that's been fragmented and bring it back together and make it whole and socialize it and make it into collective knowledge again. And this is the campesino to campesino, farmer to farmer, or peasant to peasant methodology, which is based on the horizontal exchange of knowledge, where the typical key feature is a workshop that a peasant family offers on their own farm, where they teach other peasants their agroecological processes. So the man with a sombrero there is a Cuban peasant teaching other Cuban peasants some of his agroecological processes. So it's a peer-to-peer horizontal exchange. If instead of a top-down imposition, it's a very different kind of knowledge exchange that takes place horizontally. This is something that we've also documented a lot, both in a book produced by Via Campesina itself and also in our academic research. And it addresses a common problem when there's a desire to promote or facilitate a transition from chemical monoculture to complex agroecological systems. What happens is that often this happens with the same top-down model as the Green Revolution. Now we have an agronomist trained in agroecology who's coming and telling the peasants that everything you're doing is wrong, change everything at once. And then farmers resist because that's a big risk. It's threatening. It's launching yourself into the unknown. In order to address that, the way the campesino farmer to farmer methodology works is step by step, bit by bit. And so these kind of exchanges, instead of him telling them how to change everything, they're limited to a single practice. So perhaps he's resolved a particular pest problem with a botanical pesticide preparation. The organization has invited families who have the pest but not the solution. They come to visit him and he gives them the solution. And so they make one change at a time instead of changing everything. And so they actually become agroecological even before they realize it, bit by bit over time, and doesn't provoke that kind of resistance. So if we think about a typical territory there with these atomized knowledges, there'll be some families who have agroecological practices as little islands within a sea of families with chemical monocropping dominant practices in many cases. And so the farmer organization identifies those green families and organizes those exchanges. So the whole horizontal methodology is based on a key pedagogical moment, which is when a peasant family that has an agroecological solution to a problem common to other peasant families offers a workshop on their farm to other peasants who have the problem but not the solution, as I gave the hypothetical example with that Cuban farmer. So in this process, peasants are the teachers, not the agronomists trained in the university, and their farm is their classroom. So if we think about this, traditional knowledge of how to farm and raise animals in any local environment without outside inputs like chemicals and commercial seeds, that knowledge was fragmented. was fragmented, atomized, and dispersed in the Green Revolution. And so to build or rebuild agroecological peasant territories, we need to find, recover, and share that knowledge, make it whole again, the level of the community, village, or territory. In other words, we need to decolonize knowledge at the community or territorial level. And that's the purpose of peasant to peasant, farmer to farmer, or campesino to campesino methodology. So basically what the farmer organization does is conduct a survey of all of the different families in an area, the different agroecological practices that they have, for example, crop rotation, intercropping, living fence posts, homeopathic treatment of ticks on livestock. We see some families still have a lot of practices, like Maria Diaz has 7, Victor Hernandez has 7, others have very few, like Virginia Padron, and then also does a survey of people with productive problems in order to match people with problems with people with solutions. So the first guy here, João Pedro, he has a problem of livestock with ticks. So the organization would say, you have livestock with ticks. Maria Diaz is going to have a workshop on her farm this Sunday where she's going to teach homeopathic treatment of ticks on livestock in a hands-on way. You'll see how she does it. She does it successfully, and you can solve that problem that you have. And so that's the way the methodology works. In Cuba, that methodology was introduced a little bit before the year 2000. Today, we're talking about 50% of the peasant families in the entire country through those farmer-to-farmer exchanges have changed the way that they farm. So Cuba is much smaller than India. We say that Cuba is the biggest success story proportionally because it's half of the farmers in an entire country, whereas India is the biggest success story in terms of absolute numbers, 10 million, which doesn't come anywhere close to being half of the peasants in India because it's a much bigger country. So we have one big success story numerically and another proportionally. And we learn from these and we exchange the lessons from them. An example of one particular Cuban family, what happened when they went through this process, and this is in 2004, before they participated in these farmer exchanges. You can see what the landscape of their farm looked like. And in 2010, you can see the same tree in both photographs, how they've transformed the landscape of their farm through agroforestry systems. Here's another photograph, 2004, looking at that tree. 2012, the same tree, now a complex and highly productive agroecology, diverse agroecology farming system. At the level of landscape level, before and after, now they have divided into different lots, which has some which rotate between agroforestry, tree production, annual crops, and livestock, replenishing the soil over time. Even led them to write a book. And so if we look at the history of this process in Cuba, I don't have time to go into it, so you can ask me a question about this if you want, but we've documented the whole historical process and how this has dramatically changed food production on the island. Now, what I do want to show is through the international process in La Via Campesina, these experiences through experience sharing at the international level. So instead of farmer to farmer, farmer organization to farmer organization, just as I said in the case of zero budget natural farming in India, how through our exchanges it spread to Philippines, Nepal, Indonesia, etc. The campesino methodology through exchanges that we've organized in Cuba has spread, well, first it spread around Central America, then spread to Cuba. From Cuba through Via Campesina, it spread to Mozambique, Colombia, Brazil, now in the process of exchanges with Asia. And so this same principle of horizontal exchanges at the local level also taken to the international level. So for example, one major successive exchange with Cuba was from Cuba to Mozambique through La Via Campesina, now also from Cuba to Brazil through La Via Campesina. And I won't go into this, but we've sort of distilled it down to a step-by-step process on how to generate a local agroecology farmer-to-farmer process. Now, all of these kinds of territorial processes, and there are other methodologies, not just the campesino one, need to have training of cadre in the peasant organizations in order to be able to build and accompany these kind of processes. So therefore, in the Via Campesina, we've created many different kinds of peasant farmer agroecology schools, including in Latin America, peasant universities. So for example, this is the Peasant Agroecological University in Paraguay. The Ayala refers to Latin American Agroecological Institute. That's an acronym for peasant universities in Latin America. Guarani is an indigenous language in 4 countries in South America. And so in La Via Campesina, we created this peasant university for the sons and daughters of Guarani speaking peasants from 4 countries in South America. They go to Paraguay, they get a university degree in agroecology and also in organizing and political training so that they can become skilled leaders of their organizations in the future, both in terms of agroecological processes and also in terms of political struggle. Some images, a lot of learning by doing. These are middle schools in Argentina, by the peasant organization in Argentina, to start doing agroecological training at the level of younger youth. National Agroecology School in Ecuador. Peasant Agroecology School, not university, but school in Indonesia, in Bogor. Our International Peasant Agroecology School in Karnataka, India, Amrita Bhumi, which means eternal life, where natural farming peasants teach other peasants about the zero budget natural farming practices. This month we'll be launching the new National Peasant Agroecology School in Thailand with Via Campesina Thailand and Chulalongkorn University, and focus on the global south. We have the Peasant Agroecology Center in Quebec, Canada, inspired by the Cuba experience. And so with that, I'll stop. That's been 30 minutes, so we have time for discussion. The Via Campesina slogan is globalize the struggle, globalize hope. And I could say also globalize the process in order to globalize and scale up peasant agroecology. So with that, I'll stop and we'll open the floor for questions, discussion, comments, doubts, etc.
Fantastic, Peter. Thank you for that fantastic overview of many people's lifetimes of hard work. I think that's fantastic. So we are open to questions, either type into the chat or I presume there's a function to put your hand up if you would like to, or put your video on and wave at me. Yeah, under the reactions button, there's a raise hand function if anybody wants to ask a question. So I think I will start while people are formulating their thoughts. So I have a question that I keep having, which is, do we have a sense, or do we have any models or research on what proportion of people would need to go into farming to produce enough food for healthy diets for everyone if the world were to move entirely to this farming model? I know currently we don't produce healthy diets for everyone, we produce calories. But has anyone done that work? And can we feed cities like Bangkok, if, assuming we want to keep cities like Bangkok, through sort of agroecological approaches? What would the world look like if we were moving entirely or predominantly to agroecology?
Well, I think there's a few factors involved there, and I think one change that we would need is agrarian reform in many countries around the world. But if we think about the current situation, I could take Mexico as an example, and it's not very different from other countries in the world. Let's say the typical peasant family in Mexico, I'm just going to give an arbitrary figure, but let's say they have 10 hectares of land. Currently, the most typical situation is they're only producing on 1 hectare of the 10 because bad policies for decades have undercut the viability in an economic sense of peasant agriculture, because free trade agreements and dumping from countries like the United States of cheap subsidized corn into the Mexican market have disincentivized production to the point that most able-bodied peasants are in the migrant labor stream and not producing on their home farm. They've not abandoned the farm. There's still a grandmother and maybe some grandkids living there and only producing on a tiny area. What that means is that globally we have an enormous unexploited or underexploited production potential of peasant agriculture. And we've seen many cases where there is a change in the price signals. All of a sudden, peasant agriculture responds very quickly, much faster than response to market signals from industrial commercial agriculture, because there's so many sunk costs into technologies for particular crops, so you don't get rapid change at the agribusiness level. But at the peasant level, whenever peasant farming suddenly becomes profitable again, we see labor force drawn back into the village level, and production goes up. We in fact saw that at many places in the world during the pandemic right now of COVID. The return, for example, in Thailand, 30% increase in the population of the average peasant village and significant increases in production because people lost their jobs in the city in that case, for a bad reason, not a good reason. A good reason would be if they'd raised the price of rice and then people went back because it was profitable again. So one thing is that there's already a huge underexploited potential. The other is that there are a huge number of landless peasants or land poor peasants who what they really want is access to land so that they can produce. So that's why I say agrarian reform would be a part of it. So I would say in order to be able to feed cities from peasant farming in general, or peasant agroecology specifically, we need to change the policy environment so that peasant agriculture is profitable, and we'd have to do agrarian reform. That would be the case in most countries in the world. And I would say with those two policy changes, we wouldn't have much problem at all. And if we even go back to the history of agriculture and the famous work of Esther Basara, we see that what she showed many years ago is that food production increases when the demand increases. So she showed when population density increased, people found a way to produce more, and when it didn't increase, they didn't produce more. So it's a similar kind of thing. I think that we would just need to make peasants have access to land and be able to make a living through farming, and we would see whatever amount of production is necessary would be produced in terms of meeting the effective demand of the marketplace. Over.
That's great, thank you very much. And sort of leading on from that, we have a question from Bimal in Nepal, and his question is how to create agroecology friendly markets. So what could or should be the role of local or national government? So that builds a little bit on what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things that are important. One is protecting national economies from dumping of cheap subsidized food from large agro export countries. That's one element in creating viable markets. Another thing is that governments can invest in the infrastructure for peasant marketing. In other words, can create many more plazas or marketplaces with stands that peasant families can have, and also can subsidize the transportation and facilitate the transportation of peasant produce to marketplaces. We've seen that in a variety of countries, that when governments support that, then the amount that peasants bring to market can go up dramatically. So, and also I think governments need to apply anti-monopoly policies. Most governments have good anti-monopoly laws on the book, but most governments don't ever apply those laws because of the influence of money and agribusiness power on politics. But a lot of aspects of the supermarket corporate food chain violate anti-monopoly laws in most countries in the world and create unfair competition for peasant production. So I think there's a combination of things have to take place: protecting national markets, breaking up illegal monopolies and actually applying anti-monopoly legislation, and creating the conditions for nested territorial peasant markets. And that means transportation, it means market spaces, physical spaces for markets. And then the final element would be government procurement policies. We saw, for example, during the PT governments in Brazil, that for government procurement, they had laws that 30% of all procurement had to come from local producers. Frankly, I think 30% is very low, but nevertheless, it's better than 0%. And with an extra price if the production was ecological. Unfortunately, the Obama administration challenged that in the WTO as being illegal restraint of trade through interference in the free market. And so another thing perhaps that would have to change is breaking up some of these international trade agreements, which make reasonable and decent public policies illegal at a global scale. Over.
Some big picture stuff. We have a lot of questions in the chat, but Lydia's here live and has a hand up. So Lydia, let's hear from you next.
Thank you. Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Peter. Really fascinating presentation. Lots of questions that I would like to ask, but I've selected two. One is I just want to pick your reference to Fukuoka. So there is increasingly a family of approaches outside agroecology claiming to be nature-based. So you have natural systems agriculture, regenerative organics, you have many different names. And I guess similarly to the version of agroecology that you presented, that they put the emphasis on principles rather than fixed closed recipes and little external intervention. Now, some social movements seem to be quite suspicious of some of these initiatives. And Grain, a couple of weeks ago, they published a letter accusing some of these approaches of corporate greenwashing. And in fact, if you look at some of the organizations linked to approaches like natural systems agriculture, the Land Institute or the Rodell Institute linked to regenerative agriculture, you really see they are in the business of selling stuff, right? Selling knowledge, selling training solutions to farmers in the US, but also all over the world, but selling also technology like seeds for perennial grains that the Land Institute has developed and are now being bought by General Mills. So what do you make of this turn? So that's one question. And then a quick one on agroecology in Brazil, because of your links to this field. So from what I've had a chance to see, in that context, the movement of agroecology as a movement, it's quite diverse, and they've been able to bring together a very diverse range of organizations and identities. But as a science, it seems to be still quite shaped by a particular intellectual sort of tradition that comes from elsewhere. So you see a lot of references, for example, to the Cordoba School in Spain and others. So I wonder whether you have examples of more sort of endogenous understandings of agroecology in the Brazilian context, but I guess also in other settings. And if these examples aren't there, my question is, isn't there a risk that agroecology becomes again a template and undermines its own philosophy? Thank you.
Great questions. And I'm actually going to go back briefly to my PowerPoint in order to highlight one particular thing. Where are we? Yes, I want to call attention to this article of ours in the Journal of Peasant Studies. If I can just get this out of the way. Yes. Whoops. Agricology as a territory in dispute. And exactly what we write about are the questions that you're asking about, because what happened with agroecology is for many years it was basically ignored by institutions like FAO, like governments, like agronomy faculties, like the World Bank, etc. And then as social movements and farmer innovators brought it, made it impossible to avoid, then they started ridiculing it, and now finally they're trying to co-opt it as a way of greenwashing agribusiness and politics and things like that. And so this takes place, as you said, there are a number of these things like regenerative agriculture or climate smart agriculture. There's a whole variety of other names, which in some cases cover up what I would call fake agroecologies, like industrial monocultures where you just change a few inputs from poisonous ones to organic ones without changing the economic structure of large-scale corporate monoculture, as well as corporations trying to change their image. So regenerative agriculture, for example, I think that probably whoever came up with those names initially were farmers who felt like that sounded really nice. But what it has ended up being is a depoliticized version of agroecology, because social movements have largely grabbed the banner of agroecology and put in a lot of political content like land reform, defense of land and territory, no to land grabbing, no to GMOs, things like that. That obviously, no to corporations, anti-capitalist content, peasant resistance. That's not very appealing to multinational corporations. So they've tried to get under the bandwagon of alternative names. So regenerative agriculture in the United States is now something that's supported by Cargill, Walmart, Procter and Gamble, and a who's who of global food corporations who basically want to greenwash their image by saying that they're regenerative or something like that, which is obviously complete nonsense. However, a lot of innocent people, I'm trying to stop sharing now. A lot of innocent people get sucked into these fake agroecologies or neoliberal agroecologies. And this is something that's taking place. It's like a smokescreen. They've got like 10, 15 other names now, just in order to confuse people and allow places for corporations to hide and change their images. On Brazil, I kind of share with you a critique in general, just perhaps even going beyond just agroecology, and that it's a country where a lot of social movement or alternative thinking is still quite state-centric and Western Eurocentric thinking, Cartesian thinking, and that means that a lot of agroecology has come from universities, Embrapa, international scientific journals and that kind of thing, and not enough, I would say, has come from quilombolas, indigenous communities, traditional peasant communities. That's something that we hope in La Via Campesina can be changing as we are doing pilot cases of the campesino or camponés methodology, which is a way to cast a net in a territory and find the traditional knowledge that's still there and bring it back together and socialize it and essentially create an agroecology based on local knowledge and local practices, which have been partially but not completely lost. And in my opinion, that would be where I have hope for a remedy to that particular thing that you point out, and that which I would agree with as perhaps a general, not absolute, but common valid critique in the case of Brazil. Over.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have a couple of questions here that get back to that question of knowledge. So the first one from Sarah is, based on the success story of Cuba, if half the peasants are involved in the agroecology movement, do you expect the word to spread automatically from there on? So knowledge sharing within communities, or would you still see a role of organizations as pivotal in the continuation of the transformation? And then Ayako has a question about horizontal knowledge also, horizontal knowledge dissemination. So how does this work with problems that are newer to all of us? So things like climate change and this wholesale destruction of nature. And perhaps in solving those unseen problems, might there be a role of modern or Western sciences in informing that? So a couple of questions on knowledge.
Yeah, so the first question is a good one. So if it's in half of the farmers, do we still need the methodology or the organization to spread to the others? And actually, it's something that we're currently modeling mathematically here at Ecosur on the Cuba case. And so what we can see, what we've modeled is diffusion of practices from neighbor to neighbor without an organized process. How long does that take for agroecology or agroecological processes to spread to the majority of a peasant population? Then a second case would be the extension agent or technician or agroecological agronomist who's coming from outside, like in the Brazilian case that Lydia alluded to teach the peasants how to do agroecology. Then an organized process by a peasant organization that's actively identifying the families who have the practices and bringing the other families to learn from them. And what we find modeling that mathematically is that just plain diffusion is very slow and pretty much never would ever reach all of the families, maybe in 1,000 years or something. The external technician based model is also very inefficient because each technician only attends to a limited number of families. How many technicians depends on the budget, that depends on money, and farmers don't believe much what technicians say, so the rate of contagion from the technician to the family is quite low, and that also, instead of 1,000 years, might take 150 years. And then an organized process like the one by the peasant organization with those surveys, inventories, matching, that is way faster. And so I would say that that if we're serious about responding to changing conditions in a rapid manner, there's really no substitute for that kind of a self-organized horizontal process with a methodology. Not to say that diffusion doesn't take place, because of the way it works in Cuba is the National Farmer Organization, ANAP, which is a member of Via Campesina, has a roster of families who have officially joined the movement. But when they do surveys at the village or cooperative level, they see another 15% or more of families who've adopted the practices, even though they haven't participated in the movement. So let's say maybe 50% is coming from the organized process, and then there's an extra 10 or 15% spillover or diffusion effect, which is important. It's not negligible, but clearly the intentional process is more effective. Now, in terms of the need for outside knowledge or scientific research, definitely yes, and climate change is a good example. As conditions change and no longer match historical conditions, there are going to be cases where traditional knowledge doesn't have the solution. So what was found in Cuba is that before the campesino process, there was a kind of a power dynamic / conflict between agronomists coming from research institutions in this arrogant agronomist way, telling farmers what to do, and farmers being suspicious of them and not really paying much attention, being polite when they're there, but then going back to doing what they were doing before when they leave. And now, so what they said to me in the farmer organization is, when we start a farmer-to-farmer process in a particular locality, we have to actually throw out and ban the government agronomists for about the first 2 years, so that farmers get confidence in their own process. Because otherwise the agronomist starts talking, all of the farmers shut up and look at their shoes and lose all of their protagonism in the process. But if the process really comes together and gels, and then the agronomists are allowed to come back, there's a completely different power dynamic. And now when they come back, instead of telling the farmers what to do, they arrive and the farmers take the lead and say, look, we resolved this, and this, but we still haven't figured out this. So we want you to go to your research institute and find the answer to what we're still missing. And then because they've asked for it, then they're very anxious to try it out when it comes back. And so it's much more effective, the relation or the impact of the outside scientific research on the process when farmers are empowered through their own process, and has changed the power dynamic, because it's this negative imposition power dynamic that impedes really the transfer of technology in other cases. Over.
Sounds like it's power dynamics at lots of levels that are influencing this. We have lots of questions still and only a few minutes. I'm going to suggest we take an extra 15 minutes for those who can stay. Is that okay with you, Peter? Just to answer those last few? Great. So for those who can stay, do stay on. For those who need to leave at the hour, this is being recorded, so you can catch up at the end.
Will it be posted somewhere?
Yes, so I will post the link in a moment, in fact right now, which is the Food Equity Centre seminar series. So anyone can go there and look at this and the previous and future seminars. So the next couple of questions then are around institutions and policies. So Heel is asking, can you say something about the role of second level organizations, for example, cooperatives, in sustaining the costs of the agroecological movement? He says it was quite important in Nicaragua when Campesino a Campesino started off there, and partly depended on markets such as fair trade. And then Justin is saying, he's wondering if and how allies, such as those in academia or policy making or civil society, can support to increase scale up of the agroecology movement, especially if scaling up has been despite policies rather than due to policies. So for example, does policy making or academic knowledge production offer an avenue to scaling up? So a couple on policies and institutions.
Great. So how the role of second level organizations like farmer co-ops in sustaining the cost of these processes is actually very interesting. I keep going back to the case of Cuba, but that's not surprising because it's one of our big international success stories. In the case of Cuba, the way, well, one important principle of farmer to farmer is that the families who share their knowledge, in Cuba they call them promoters, who receive the visits on their own farm, they should not be paid in any way. They are chosen because they're already successful farmers because of those practices that they use. Because what's been found out, and this is a reason why many agroecology processes don't work in other places, is if the promoters are paid, other farmers don't believe them. They think, oh, he's just doing that because he's being paid to do it. And if I was paid to stand on my head for 6 hours a day, I would do it, but I wouldn't recommend anybody else to do it. So one principle of Campesino a Campesino is that the families who are chosen to have the exchanges don't get paid for it. They do it out of their own goodwill and because they're living successfully off of their agroecological farming. However, their salaries are needed at the next level of the process, which are what are called facilitators, which are people who, from the peasant organization itself, cadre of the organization, but paid staff, who go out in the community and do those surveys and organize the exchanges and help the families prepare for them. So what they've done in Cuba is, since most of their farmers are members of cooperatives, the cooperative itself hires the facilitator as a technical staff who works for the co-op and whose bosses are the peasants who are members of the co-op. So there's a key role in making sure that the power dynamic is from peasant to technical staff and not from technical staff to peasant, if you catch my drift. And it might be, you know, it would be difficult to sustain the cost of a national movement that has a role for technical staff without a way for it to self-finance. And therefore, I think you've pointed out a key element that's made it possible in Cuba is the fact that most farmers are organized into cooperatives, which means that they have collective accumulation at the community level, and that collective accumulation in an economic sense can defray the costs of this kind of a process. So I think I think that's a very important thing. Now, fair trade has largely been a disappointment for a lot of the farmer movement. So, for example, I live here in Chiapas, Mexico, which was the world epicenter of the peasant organic coffee boom starting about 30 years ago. And now at that point, 20 years ago, 60% of all organic coffee traded in the world came from this one state in Mexico. Now that everybody does it, it's no longer such a big proportion here. But we have been targeted by every fair trade association in the United States, Europe, etc. But if I go out 1 hour from where I am right now and visit any of the co-ops, they'll tell me that they're not happy with it because they spend $5,000 to $7,000 for fair trade certification every year, yet only market 1 or 2% of their coffee through fair trade channels. So my conclusion about fair trade is that it's great for educating consumers in the North, but it doesn't really make much difference at all here at the ground level. And the fact that they have co-ops and can self-fund their own processes is way more important than whether those co-ops are selling in the fair trade market or not in terms of the territorial level. Now, the fact that there is an organic market that gives a higher price, that is important, because maybe they're only selling 1 or 2% in fair trade, but they're selling 70 or 80% organic certified. So I guess that's had a bigger role, but there's also a lot of questions about organic certification. When it was all done by, for example, European and American US certifiers, they were imposing ridiculous, unfeasible practices here because of total lack of knowledge of local reality. The co-ops rebelled against that, and now there's a lot of local Mexican certifying organizations who sometimes struggle to have their certification recognized in Europe or the US, but at least the local certification doesn't make them do unreasonable practices that aren't feasible under local conditions. But I think more important than the certification is the organization at the territorial and community level. And when there are co-ops that are functioning well, that really facilitates everything else. Now, the role for academics, researchers, and the policy process, I think that one thing that we found in Via Campesina with academics like myself who are in both sides is the legitimation role. So peasant organizations are saying to governments, you should have policies that favor peasant agriculture and agroecology. And then governments are saying, well, what's your evidence? And then they say, oh, well, it's working really well for us. And they say, show us numbers. And peasant organizations are not doing very much self-research or publishing, legitimizing academic papers. So it is important to have academic allies, and for many reasons, but one of them is the legitimation role. And other ways are to help facilitate, like as I explained before, sometimes there is the need, or many times there is the need for external knowledge and research, but linked into a well-functioning peasant process. So definitely there are different roles. And I think that, so in no way is the peasant movement discarding the importance of academic allies or researchers. The key take-home lesson is change the power dynamic relation, not get rid of the academic allies. Over.
Indeed. So the next question is about the sort of food system more broadly. I think it's about how agroecology can engage with the food system. So the question is about how the international freight industry plays a role in potentially limiting transformative potential of agroecology, in the sense that they control the transportation of global food production, but perhaps there are other parts of the food system that are also limited in or limiting change. Could you speak to that? Oh, you're muted.
Extend the idea of the global freight system to the global commodity traders, who often are the owners or leasers of most of the global freight industry, like Cargill or Archer Daniels Midland or Bunge. They're the major forces of evil in our global food system that are manipulating the levels of policy, the levers of policy in governments through money and politics, through influence at the WTO and free trade and trade agreements that favor this absurd global system where we're moving towards a world where nobody will eat what's produced in their own country, but send everything produced in their country halfway around the world, and everything they'll eat will be brought back from halfway around the world, undercutting local production, causing climate change through greenhouse gas emission due to unnecessary global transport. And so basically the whole food sovereignty paradigm is political struggle against that model, that global corporate food system model that's based on global freight and global transport, and trying to do political struggle at the national level to protect national markets and national producers from the illegal and unethical trade practices that are part of that nexus of the global commodity traders and the global freight industry. And if you look at the traditional colonial structure of transport within countries, we'll see that the colonial structure is from agricultural production areas to ports, which doesn't really support national and local economies. And a transportation infrastructure that would support the development of local food systems and local economies would be a different kind of transport infrastructure that, instead of being from agricultural areas to ports, would be a crisscrossing kind of a road network, and would be government support for local and medium distance transport and not long distance bulk transport to ports. So definitely there would have to be some major policy change in terms of government regulation and public sector investment and subsidies in transportation if we were to change that food system. And those are part of the demands in the food sovereignty struggle. Over.
Fantastic. And I think appropriately, the last question we have sort of comes back to how we can support family farmers, how we can support the people you've been talking about. So Julian says, family farming is obviously risky in the absence of other livelihoods. Things like ill health and crop failure and the like can result in impoverishment. So what options would you propose, or do people propose, for social protection interventions that could assist transitions to agroecology that may result in unanticipated or negative outcomes? Is there anything we can do to support that transition?
Yes. So for example, subsidized public sector crop insurance for peasants, which is a demand of Via Campesina organizations in almost every country in the world, where typically crop insurance is only available to large-scale commercial producers. But in our success story in Cuba, and I keep coming back to that, about 70% of all peasant farmers in Cuba have crop insurance. Basically, first of all, in Cuba, credit is democratized in the sense that it's not restricted either through cost or commercial relations or whatever to a large-scale private sector, which doesn't exist anyway. And credit rates are subsidized and automatically come with highly subsidized public sector crop insurance. And so if you think about Cuba as a country in the path of many hurricanes every year, it basically would be impossible to maintain any kind of sustained food production without some kind of a public sector crop insurance scheme and livestock insurance scheme. And so I think that's an example of the kind of social protections that we would need if we really wanted to achieve what Jody was talking about, which would be really feed cities or national populations from peasant agriculture as opposed to corporate agriculture. Remember, corporate agriculture is getting an unbelievable amount of hidden and non-hidden subsidies. And I remember once when I was in Cuba in an academic forum, as someone born in the United States, a Cuban scientist challenged me and said, why does the US say that its agricultural system is sustainable if there are $30 billion of subsidies every year that go to sustaining an unsustainable system? And here we have a tiny microscopic fraction of those subsidies that are holding up a much more sustainable system. So the unsustainable are the enormous amount of public sector resources that are redirected to support unsustainable large-scale corporate monoculture and long-distance shipping. And we really need to change that around. We could save a lot of that money by having just reasonable subsidies that would go to peasant agriculture as opposed to unreasonable massive ones that currently sustain the unsustainable corporate system. Over.
That's fantastic, Peter. So yeah, lots to do from the top and the bottom to move in those directions. This has been fascinating, as always. Everybody who's written a question has said thank you for a fascinating presentation. We've seen you've written an awful lot of papers and books on these issues, so people do go and look up some of those, which I'm sure will have further information on all of these things. It's obviously a discussion we could have for a very long time. But I think we're out of questions, and we will leave it there. So thank you very much, Peter, for joining us, and thanks to everyone else who could join us today. Well,
thank you very much, Jody and IDS, for the invitation, the Food Equity Seminar Series, and thank you for the great questions, everybody. And it's been a pleasure for me as well. So bye-bye.
Fantastic. Take care, everybody.